Awesome. Thank you for the introduction. My name is John Haverkamp. I'm one of the newer safety specialists with ehsInc. Today, as stated, we're going to do a quick touch and go on indoor heat safety. So, just as I'm going through it, today we're going to be going over a proposed standard, some definitions, some water requirements, access to cooldown areas, assessment and control measures, emergency response procedures, acclimatization, training requirements, and indoor heat illness prevention plans. Today's webinar covers the latest draft and proposed standard that Cal-OSHA is set to introduce to propose workers from indoor workplace heat illness. Overall, the standard will apply to all indoor work areas where the temperature equals or exceeds 82 degrees Fahrenheit when employees are present. Now, that 82 degrees, that is not exclusive to just temperature. That does take humidity into account. That is the heat index. Furthermore, Cal-OSHA defines indoor as a space that is under a ceiling or overhead covering that restricts airflow and is enclosed along its entire perimeter by walls, doors, windows, dividers, or other physical barriers that restrict airflow, whether opened or closed. Simply put, if you have four walls, no matter how many bay doors, bay windows you have open, it doesn't matter. If there's four walls and a roof, that is defined as indoor.
John, do you mind going back one slide? Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but I want to cover this as well. I forgot to tell you guys the QR codes. We are now starting to incorporate these. So if you have a smartphone, use that. Just scan that QR code to get that digital copy of the draft. John, if you don't mind, if we can leave the slide open for the next minute. If you have an iPhone, just literally point the camera to that QR code. It should automatically register that quick response and have that draft in your phone. If you're using an Android, you got to literally download a QR code app prior and doing that. I appreciate it, John. I didn't mean to interrupt.
No problem.
And we'll leave it open for the next 30 seconds. And again, we'll have this PDF handout for you available after the presentation if you weren't able to see it prior to joining. But we're going to utilize these QR codes because they are pretty cool to use if you have a smartphone or tablet with you. All right, John, thank you so much.
No problem. All right, so talking about the proposed standard. California is already an active outdoor workplace heat illness standard, T8 CCR 3395. It's been in effect since 2006. However, there is currently nothing 100% in place for indoor workplace heat illness. That is soon to change. We're looking at about 2020 for that to go and get implemented. Cal-OSHA has initiated training and enforcement to protect workers against indoor heat illness via its injury and illness prevention program. As of right now, even though there is nothing as far as an indoor heat prevention plan, workers are still protected under the IIPP of Cal-OSHA. 2012, Cal-OSHA issued 2 serious citations to 2 joint employers for violation of the IIPP standard because an employee sustained injury due to heat illness while working indoors. Several factors were evaluated, including ventilation of the facility, access to water, types of machines, and whether they generated heat, whether there is an air-conditioned system, whether the work performed by employees is fast-paced, the breaks or recovery periods provided to employees, and whether there is a period of acclimatization provided to employees. In October 2016, Governor Brown signed and approved Senate Bill 1167, which went into effect as of January 1st, 2017. Went into effect, that's still being worked on. The law directs Cal-OSHA to draft and propose new standard to propose workers from indoor workplace heat illness. As I said, it is still currently being drafted up. It's being refined, and we're looking at around somewhere 2020, we will go and start seeing it actually being implemented. Here's just kind of a brief timeline, starting from 2016 to current of when it was first introduced. Revisions being done. Currently, we are on the current revision. We can still be looking at further revisions. Some basic definitions for the indoor heat prevention. A lot of this runs pretty parallel to what is already currently situated for outdoor heat illness. Acclimatization, temporary adaptation to the body to work in the heat that occurs gradually when a person is exposed to it. Acclimatization peaks in most people within 4 to 14 days of regular work for at least 2 hours per day in the heat. What we're talking about here is primarily it's focused towards the new worker. You get a new person in the building that isn't currently used to the workload and isn't used to the heat involved with it, needs a little bit of time to get going and used to it. This isn't just limited to that new person, though. It can be involved with any of your existing workers, any of the guys that weren't, and maybe they were working in the office for a period of time where it was air conditioned, now stepping out into the main area of the work field, going and just need to go and get used to it again. Same thing, maybe they went, took vacation, took sick leave, whatever it may be. They need to go and get used to stepping back up to that work pace and working in those heat conditions. Basic engineering control, an aspect of the work area or a device that removes or reduces hazardous conditions or creates a barrier between the employee and the hazard. Examples of engineering controls that may be effective at minimizing the risk of heat illness in a particular work area include isolation of hot processes, isolation of employees from sources of heat, air conditioning, and cooling fans. Something as simple as a fan can be greatly effective. Other things that could be also implemented other than just cooling fans. Misters, one of the going and working in the past, working in a warehouse myself, going and having a misting fan right there kind of nearby, primarily near a rest area, was substantially convenient. Would be not only is it providing a nice breeze, but then also a cool generated mist in order to go and help the sweat go and actually go and cool you down. And the administrative control, a process that limits exposure to any hazard by adjustment of work procedures or work schedules. Examples of administrative controls that may be effective at minimizing the risk of heat illness in a particular work area include acclimatization employees, rotating employees, scheduling work earlier or later in the day, using work rest schedules, reducing work intensity or speed, changing required work clothing, and using relief workers. Not only are those all great examples, but it is also something that is greatly beneficial. Additional training, going and getting those guys aware of what the do's and don'ts, what is greatly beneficial. It is amazing on how many times you go and talk to these guys on how much water they should be drinking, what they should be doing to help themselves, and that isn't very clear. Some guys are thinking that maybe only 2 cups of water an hour is sufficient. As we go on, you will see that it really isn't, depending on conditions. Personal heat protection equipment. Equipment worn to protect the user against heat illness. Examples of personal protective equipment that may be effective at minimizing the risk of heat illness in a particular work area include water-cooled garments, air-cooled garments, cooling vests, wetted overgarments, heat reflective clothing, and supplied air personal cooling systems. As you see in that picture, that vest, I can speak for it personally as somebody that goes out and does a lot of dirt bike riding, a lot of motorcycle riding out in the desert where it's 100 degrees during July. That does substantially work. Even as something as a wet rag, a wet bandana around the neck, taking a 5-minute break of just going and doing something of resting a cool rag against the neck, wrist, armpit, greatly reduces that core temperature, greatly goes, and then also helps your cognitive skills. Full body clothing, clothing that restricts heat removal, full body clothing covering the arms, legs, and torso. That in any way of the following that is waterproof, designed to protect the wearer from a chemical, biological, radiological, or fire hazard, designed to protect the wearer or the work process from contamination, not only for waterproof or something of PPE of hazmat suits, something as simple as heavy-duty coveralls, something that is most common in the work field. Heavy-duty coveralls, a huge insulator, going to go and greatly go and overheat the wearer, going and therefore should be going and working in even cooler environments. We'll go and we'll touch base on this as we go and progress through in the next hour or so. Environmental risk factors, working conditions that create the possibility that heat illness could occur, including air temperature, relative humidity, radiant heat from the sun and other sources. Conductive heat sources such as the ground, air movement, or actually more lack thereof air movement, workload severity and duration, protective clothing and personal protective equipment worn by employees. We all know hot is hot. Summertime, it's going to be a whole lot warmer than it is back in January. With that, working indoors, you don't have much airflow as you would outdoors where you have a nice breeze going through you. That is the whole point of engineering controls, going and mechanically providing for that breeze. Some of us may know it. Humidity, it does go and play a role. 90 degrees out in open desert where humidity is down to 10% is a whole lot different than somewhere in Atlanta where it's 90 degrees and 98% humidity. Feels a whole lot hotter as that humidity level goes up. Radiant heat, even if you're working in an environment in which, say, it's only 75 degrees, you're working near a machine that is kicking off a lot more heat than that. To that person in that immediate environment, it may feel significantly warmer. For radiant heat, it's not going to just radiate through the whole building. Maybe at one corner of the building, it is only 75 degrees. Maybe in that one section in which the machines are going and kicking off a tremendous amount of heat. Maybe it feels more like 85 plus in that corner of the building. As far as going and measuring, that needs to be taken into account as well. Personal risk factors. Factors such as individuals' age, degree of equalization, health, water consumption, alcohol consumption, caffeine consumption, and use of prescription medications that affect the body's water retention or other physiological responses to heat. We all know as age goes on, it goes and has effects on our health. Primarily for your general workers, though, it's going to be more of the water consumption. Most of us go and have that misconception of when we get dehydrated, we feel hungry. Rather than going and getting the proper amount of water, we instead go and eat. We need to understand that we should be going and drinking minimal quantities of water. Alcohol consumption, caffeine consumption, basic rule of thumb. If you're, first off, we shouldn't be drinking at work, right? Anyways, alcohol does dehydrate you. That morning cup of coffee that you had does dehydrate you. You need to compensate with extra water additional to the recommended amount. Prescriptions, even vitamins. If you go and look at your basic canister of vitamins, it says go and up your water intake. General rule of thumb for every vitamin that you are taking, if you're taking vitamins, you should be drinking an additional 8 ounces of water, including on top of what you're already supposed to be drinking. So for your cooldown area, an indoor or outdoor area that is blocked from direct sunlight and shielded from other high radiant heat sources and is either open to air or provided with ventilation and cooling. Preventive cooldown rests means a rest taken in a cooldown area to prevent overheating. With your cooldown area, primarily speaking for when we're talking outdoor, it needs to be provided for. Now, does that mean just as something like an easy up? Not always. It needs to be a sufficient amount of shade. If we're talking indoor, we're probably going to be talking about a break room or at least a covered overhang patio, Something of that means that for sure these guys are sitting down in a cool environment in the shade and without having to go and sit shoulder to shoulder and more or less nearly sitting in each other's laps. They need to have sufficient area to go and about. If they're going and having a meal, they don't need to go and rub elbows with one another. It also means, as I jokingly say, you can't just go and have a porta potty sitting outside the building and have these guys sitting in a porta potty. Not only does it need to be cool and free for them to go and sufficiently move, it also needs to be sanitary. For the preventive cooldown rest, you'll notice that it says the word rest, not break. There's a difference between a rest and a break. Obviously, they're already in their 15-minute breaks and their lunch break. This is a rest. Not all of us can go and handle the same stressors as the person to the left or right of you. There are some people that need to go and take that extra bit of a rest. It could be as short as 2 minutes. It could go upwards from there. Now, it is all designated on a basic observation and going and checking in with that person on their current situation. Globe temperature, the temperature measured by a globe thermometer, which consists of a thermometer sensor in the center of a 6-inch diameter hollow copper sphere painted on the outside with a matte black finish or equivalent. Globe thermometer may not be shielded from direct exposure of radiant heat while a globe thermometer is being measured. The purpose of the globe thermometer, rather than just having a thermostat or some other means of pulling out your cell phone and going and saying, what's the temperature? It takes the radiant heat into account. It takes the humidity into account. You see this a lot of the times. If anybody goes and runs marathons, they have these constantly throughout the whole course set up in order to go and give runners an idea of, yes, it may only be 75 degrees, but 75 degrees in direct sunlight with, say, 50% humidity feels significantly warmer than 75 degrees. For what you guys may be dealing with radiant heat, whether it's machines, welding, metal fabrication, whatever it may be, those machines, no matter what, will be kicking off heat. If you're standing next to it for an X period of time, you're going to be dealing with significantly more heat than just the 75 degrees that Weather Channel is telling you it's going to be today. Heat wave. There's two different ways to define the heat wave. Any day in which the predicted high outdoor temperature for the day will be at least 80 degrees Fahrenheit and at least 10 degrees Fahrenheit higher than the average high daily outdoor temperature in the preceding 5 days. With that, if it's 80 degrees or more, that's a heat wave. 82 degrees, heat wave. But for sake of conversation, say the last 5 days have been 65 degrees out. That's not a heat wave, but tomorrow it's going to be 75, 76 degrees. Per the original definition of 80 degrees, it's still 4 degrees under, but it is going from 65 to 77. That is a 12-degree bump. That is, though it's still under 80 degrees, that 10-degree bump makes it, by definition, a heat wave. Going and, as if you want to go and kind of go make a real stretch, you pull somebody from Alaska for work today. It may only be 40 degrees up there. They're going to go and define that as hot to them. Heat is perspective. Some people go and enjoy it. Some people don't. Heat illness and heat index. Heat illness means serious medical condition resulting from the body's inability to cope with a particular heat load and includes heat cramps, heat exhaustion, heat syncope, and heat stroke. Heat index means a measure of heat stress developed by the National Weather Service for outdoor environments that takes into account the dry bulb temperature and relative humidity. For the purpose of the standard, heat index refers to the conditions in indoor work areas. Heat index, as I believe I've stated before, is simply taking the temperature plus the humidity. Not, as the example I keep giving, if we were sitting coastal in Huntington Beach, 75 degrees is probably going to feel like 75 degrees, maybe even cooler, because of the fact that you're getting a cool breeze and the humidity is going to be relatively low. Say we go to the other coast, go back to Georgia, 90% humidity at 75 degrees, it's going to feel significantly worse. That sweat that you're producing isn't going to be kicking off of us. It's going to go and just be kind of a miserable day. As far as talking about heat illness has a couple different components to it. There's heat rash, heat cramps, heat exhaustion, and heat stroke. Heat rash can be as simple as the reddening of the skin, kind of getting a prickly, itchy feeling, all because of clogged sweat glands. Simplest way of going and dealing with something as heat rash, going and constantly keeping the skin clean, keeping the skin dry, going and rotating work uniforms, shirts, whatever it may be, in order to go and keep those clothes clean and dry. Heat cramps can be something from losing salt, from sweating. What we're familiar with, that fancy term electrolytes, just a fun, fancy way of saying salt. Though water is going to probably be the best means of hydration, something of a Gatorade, something with some degree of salt, is going to be also great in days where there's high heat, high exertion in the workload, going and doing that nice balance in order to make sure that person is staying healthy. Heat exhaustion, that is when it is dangerous. It is something to definitely be taken into account. It's the step leading towards heat stroke. Heat exhaustion, the person becomes tired, weak, dizzy, may have damp and clammy skin. Simple way of going and dealing with something like this, going and letting the person sit, primarily even lay in the shade, go and rest cooling rags onto them. I would not advise to go and start laying ice packs onto them. If you go and hose them down with ice cold water, dump cold water on them, just lay a bunch of ice packs onto them, you can put that person into shock. That is obviously something that we all want to avoid. Heat stroke, extremely dangerous, can be fatal. It's when the core temperature rises above 105 degrees. Person's cognitive skills, their thought process is absolutely gone. You are sitting there, you are going and making sure that that person is getting cooled down. At that point, you're also probably going to be going and looking at implementing EMS or whatever emergency procedures you have in the policy for your business. So here's a basic chart talking about heat index. If you look to the left, you see the relative humidity, and then up top, obviously the temperature. 80 degrees isn't always 80 degrees. As the temperature goes up, so does the heat index. Good chart. I would say recommended. Have it even maybe posted somewhere so people get a concept of what this actually is. When I talk heat index to others, a lot of the times this gets lost in communication. It's a great visual to actually go and have people understand what is being said. All right, relative humidity means the amount of moisture in the air relative to the amount that would be present if the air were saturated. Temperature means the dry bulb temperature in the degrees Fahrenheit obtainable by using a thermometer freely exposed to the air without considering humidity or radiant heat. To measure the temperature in the immediate area where employees are located. Temperature plus relative humidity equals your heat index. High radiant heat work area. A work area where the globe temperature is at least 5 degrees Fahrenheit greater than the temperature. That's not the temperature in that immediate work area. That's the overall general temperature. You will go out and pull out your cell phone, open up your weather app, whatever it may be. The temperature, again, just keep it at 75 degrees. You go and measure with the globe thermometer, globe temperature in that immediate work area, and it's 80 degrees. That would be defined as a high radiant heat work area. Radiant heat means heat transmitted by electromagnetic waves and not transmitted by conduction or convection. Sources of radiant heat include the sun, hot objects, hot liquids, hot surfaces, and fire. Obviously, all basic examples. I hope you guys aren't having open fires going on at your work, but I'm assuming there are plenty of hot surfaces, even something as a compressor, an air compressor that is running for 8+ hours a day can go and greatly heat up and go and radiate heat, going and coming from the career paths I've worked in. Sitting over a welder and working for 8 hours, that is a great source of radiant heat.
John, if you don't mind, I'm gonna jump in here. If there's a fire, God, indoor heat is your last concern. We had a question coming from Alex. He's I think we might have covered it early on in the presentation, but he's asking, hey, since the standard isn't out officially in 2020 or right now, can they still be cited for indoor heat stress?
Yes, even though this currently isn't policy, since even though this isn't going into effect till 2020, they can still be cited through the IIPP. Though this isn't 100% set in stone, you need, even though they're indoors, there are means and measures in which OSHA is going and still protecting these guys indoors to make sure that the place of business is safe for them to go and actually be doing the job that they need to be doing.
Thanks, John. And just as a reminder, folks, to ask those questions in, utilize that Q&A panel or chat. He has them both open in his screen. Thank you so much, John.
No problem. So, shielding, a physical barrier between radiant heat sources and employees that reduces the transmission of radiant heat. This can be as something as simple as a wall, as something as simple as a piece of steel. You get even something as fancy as a gold wrap, heat wrap, proper insulation. Something, even foam insulation goes both ways. Not only does it keep things cool, but it also goes and keeps the heat away from you. Shielding is probably a very simple means of going and preventing heat, but it's not 100% foolproof either. So for your water requirements, employees shall have access to potable drinking water that is fresh, pure, suitably cool, and provided to employees free of charge. The water shall be located as close as practicable to the areas where employees are working and in indoor cool-down areas. That water, big thing, I jokingly say it, you can't just go down to the LA River, go down to the Santa Ana River and scoop out water from there. It can't just go and be gray water. It needs to be clean. It needs to be potable. That also doesn't mean you have to go down to your local convenience store and get all of them a bunch of Fiji waters and Voss waters. There needs to be some give and take to that one. With the suitably cool aspect of it, it needs to be cooler than the ambient temperatures around it. That doesn't mean it has to be absolutely ice cold, but also simultaneously it doesn't need to be that, as I've said it to people in the past, you have the bottle of water in the front seat of your car that's just been cooking in the sun all day. Though you may want to drink it because you're thirsty, that's up to you. Employers should not be providing water that's been kind of sitting stagnant for 3 days and also been cooking in the sun for that same period of time. Where drinking water is not plumbed or otherwise continuously supplied, it shall be provided in sufficient quantity at the beginning of the work shift to provide 1 quart per employee per hour for drinking for the entire shift. That's 8 quarts of water. That is 2 gallons of water per employee. Other than just being provided, even if water is plumbed in, even if water is provided, it is not very common for employees to want to actually be going and keeping track of their water intake. If you're supervisor role, if you're a management, whatever it may be, Make it almost like a recommendation. Encourage the fact that they are drinking water. It's going to go, not only does it go and prevent any sorts of heat illness, also goes and promotes positive cognitive skills. So they're going and kind of keeping focused at task at hand. So access to cooldown areas. The employer shall have and maintain one or more cooldown areas at all times. The cooldown area shall be at least large enough to accommodate the number of employees on recovery or rest periods so that they can sit in a normal posture fully in the cooldown area without having to be in physical contact with each other. Again, as I jokingly said, that doesn't mean you go and get a whole bunch of individual porta potties for them to go and sit in. It needs to be cool. It needs to go and have them open and be able to sit down comfortably. It also needs to be sanitary. If we're working in an environment, it does not need to be indoors. It does need to be covered and shaded, though. The cooldown area shall be located as close as practical to the areas where employees are working. The size of the cooldown area during meal periods shall be at least enough to accommodate the number of employees on the meal period who remain on site. The temperature in indoor cooldown areas shall be maintained at least than 82 degrees Fahrenheit unless the employer demonstrates it is infeasible. Employees shall be allowed and encouraged to take a preventative cooldown rest in a cooldown area when they feel the need to do so. An employee who takes a preventative cooldown rest shall be monitored and asked if he or she is experiencing symptoms of heat illness, shall be encouraged to remain in the cooldown area, and shall not be ordered back to work until any signs or symptoms of heat illness have abated, but in no event less than 5 minutes in additional to the time needed to access the cooldown area. With this, I understand that some people like to go and play that system of if you give somebody an inch, they're going to take a mile. With that, cooldown rests should be encouraged. There's been too many times for me working in the field where you see kind of the whip being whipped and people going and continue being pushed to the breaking point. I've seen where individuals go and are forced to go and take a week plus off because they are incapable of coming back to work because they are going and dealing with heat exhaustion and on that hairy edge of heat stroke. With that, it also means monitor them, ask them questions. If you're going and monitoring them, you could get a basic idea if they're actually experiencing signs of heat illness or if they're just looking to go and take a bonus 5-minute break. Again, it's not a cool down break, it is a cool down rest. Access to cooldown areas. If an employee exhibits signs or reports symptoms of heat illness while taking a preventative cooldown rest or down preventative cooldown rest periods, the employer shall provide appropriate first aid or emergency response. With appropriate first aid, it could be as something as going and making sure they are laying down in the shade. They are going and cool rags are being provided for in order to put on their neck, chest, and the armpit areas. Also, an idea of a recovery position of sorts in which knees are elevated, and it may be even going and putting, while they're laying on their backs on the ground, going and putting their feet on an elevated surface to have their legs elevated. All great means in which going and promoting blood flow to the core, to the brain, to go and get the blood flow where it absolutely needs to be in order to help that person prevent heat illness. So your assessment and control measures. Assessment and control measures. The employer shall measure and record the temperature or heat index, whichever is greater, and shall identify and evaluate all other environmental risk factors for heat illness if any of the following conditions are met. Having a temperature that equals or exceeds 87 degrees Fahrenheit when employees are present, or when the heat index equals or exceeds 87 degrees Fahrenheit when employees are present, or employees wearing clothing that restricts heat removal and the temperature equals or exceeds 82 degrees Fahrenheit. With that, as we kind of said, if you're wearing more, it would be silly at this time of year to go and wear a winter jacket. Kind of what that is talking about. That is why you're seeing two different temperatures. If you have to wear appropriate PPE for the environment that you're working in, such as even something as coveralls, that temperature should be reduced in order to take those PPE measures into account. With that as well, as I stated before, maybe one side of the building does go and meet that temperature requirement. Maybe the opposite corner, in which there is radiant heat coming off of machinery, off of equipment, exceeds that temperature. Those factors should be taken into account. More than just kind of stepping out of office, stepping into the work environment briefly and doing one quick measurement. Those measurements should be done throughout the building to go and also get you an idea of where temperature differences are happening. Basic idea of what that record keeping could look like. Should be clean, should be orderly, should be legible. The employer shall establish and maintain accurate records of temperature or heat index measurements, whichever are required. The records shall include date, time, specific location of all measurements. Sorry, guys. Temperature or heat index measurements, whichever are required, shall be taken where employees work and at times during the work shift when employee exposures are expected to be at the highest. Everyone's always kind of looking for that shortcut. That doesn't mean we're doing our temperature measurements at 6 a.m. when we know that building, that work environment is going to be at its coolest. We need to go and hope for the best, but plan for the worst in this one. We are taking our measurements at the highest temperature. If that means we're doing multiple readings through the day to get a gauge on that, then so be it. Initial measurements shall be taken when it is reasonable to suspect indoor high heat, as discussed in this section. Measurements shall be taken again when they are reasonably expected to be 10 degrees or more above the previous measurements. Temperature or heat index records shall be retained for 12 months or until the next measurements are taken, whichever is later, and made available at the work site to employees and Cal/OSHA representatives. Since this involves and does affect employees, they do have the right to understand the work environment that they are working in and to understand the temperatures in which they are working in. With that bullet point 2, expected to be 10 degrees or more above the previous measurements, there is that basic number 2 definition of a heat wave. So your measurement instruments. Instruments used to measure the temperature or heat index shall be used and maintained according to the manufacturer's recommendations. Instructions. Instruments used to measure the heat index shall utilize the National Weather Service index tables. With those means of measuring it, make sure those instruments are being constantly maintained, updated, whatever need be. There's too many times in which you go and are talking to individuals that have the proper instruments, but they haven't been gone and recalibrated since they opened the box. I understand that folded piece of paper that comes in the box with the instrument is not something that we want to read. There is plenty of information, though, in that we should be reading. Not only should we be reading it, we should also keep it with us on hand in order if we go and hit a wall, hit a roadblock with the instrument itself. 9 times out of 10, the needed information is in that booklet, in that basic piece of folded paper. So, written procedures. If it's not documented, did it ever actually happen? The employer shall have effective procedures to obtain the active involvement of employees and their union representatives in the following: designing, conducting, and recording the measurements of temperature or heat index, whichever is greater, identifying and evaluating all other environmental risk factors for heat illness. As I said, not only is the temperature something we need to be taken into account, that humidity, temperature plus humidity, heat index. So the employer shall use control measures to minimize the risk of heat illness. The selection of control measures shall be based on the environmental risk factors for heat illness present in the work area. If you're looking to the diagram to your right, as I jokingly say, it's an upside down food triangle, but for safety. From top to bottom, a basic question I go and ask a lot of the guys in the field: what is the best means of protection? Is PPE your first line of defense or your last line of defense? Surprisingly enough, I would say probably about 90%, if not more, of people that respond to it say PPE is your number one means of defense. It's not. It is your last line of defense. For what we're talking about today, for heat illness, heat prevention, it isn't always possible to eliminate the heat. The only way to eliminate the heat is to go and either work at nighttime or work exclusively at wintertime. I don't think that's going to be very beneficial to you guys. There's no way of substituting out the heat. Again, unless you're working exclusively at nighttime or during winter months. But we can go and do engineering controls and administrative controls. And then finally, if need be, go and provide them with the necessary PPE to keep them cool and keep them running efficiently. So with your engineering controls shall be used to reduce and maintain both the temperature and heat index to below 87 degrees Fahrenheit when employees are present, or the temperature to below 82 degrees Fahrenheit when employees wearing clothing that restricts heat removal or work in high radiant heat work areas, except to the extent that the employer demonstrates such controls are infeasible. Basic engineering controls. A fan. It is something that go put into place, have the person standing next to. Sufficient, potentially gets the job done, but on top of it, that is just one step in the right direction. Fan with a mister. Go, if possible, if able to do it, air conditioning in that environment. All different engineering principles. Not saying that these are exclusive, the only ones, just the basic, what we all see in indoor work environments. Administrative controls. Where feasible, engineering controls are not sufficient to reduce and maintain the temperature and heat index to below 87 degrees Fahrenheit when employees are present, or the temperature to below 82 degrees Fahrenheit where employees wear clothing that restricts heat removal or work in high radiant heat work areas. Administrative controls shall be used to minimize the risk of heat illness, except to the extent that the employer demonstrates such controls are infeasible. A basic administrative control that I can't see that would be deemed infeasible. Training. If you go and get these guys even a basic 1 hour touch and go on the do's and don'ts of heat illness, on heat illness prevention, goes a long way. Just go and they already know it, as long as you go and kind of remind them of something that they already know. Gets that mindset rolling for them, gets them to think more safely, more efficiently, therefore going and helping everyone in the long run. Personal heat protective equipment. Where feasible, engineering controls are not sufficient to reduce and maintain the temperature and heat index to below 87 degrees Fahrenheit, when employees are present, or the temperature to below 82 degrees Fahrenheit, where employees wear clothing that restricts heat removal, or work in high radiant heat work areas. Personnel heat protective equipment shall be used to minimize the risk of heat illness, except to the extent that the employer demonstrates that the use of such equipment is infeasible. Again, there are some things in there that I would say, as a blanking statement, most industries you could go and use a lot. Something as simple as a cooling rag around the back of the neck. There are plenty of very simple heat soak equipment that you could get anywhere and everywhere to go and reduce heat for those employees. As the picture early on in the slides, that heat, the cooling vest, I can speak firsthand for something like that, where go and soak it in cool water for about 2 minutes. Yes, you're going to go and get wet, but at the same time, for me, myself, I would rather go and have my work shirt, my work pants moderately wet, than go and be absolutely sweating and dying because of the heat in the environment that I'm dealing with. At that point, that general appearance of being wet kind of goes and gets outweighed by the idea of I'm going to be able to at least be cool, comfortable, my cognitive skills are 100% there. With that, they're going to be making less flu pause, less brain farts while going and working, because they're not thinking, I'm hot, I'm miserable, I can't go and think of anything other than me being hot and miserable. With that, they're able to actually go and stay focused on task at hand. A lot of injuries are prevented because that basic, you get distracted, you lose mindset for 2 seconds, there's that injury. Simple way of going and preventing that 2-second mind lapse. All right, so emergency response procedures. Everyone needs it. It is OSHA mandated that there needs to be emergency response procedures in every place of business. It could be something as simply saying, call 911. There's some workplaces that have their own in-house procedures that lead up to the potential of having to call out to EMS services. The employer must have effective procedures for ensuring that effective communication by voice, observation, or electronic means is maintained so that employees at the work site can contact a supervisor or emergency medical services when necessary. A simple means for people to get in touch with each other is your cell phone. Everyone has one. Everyone, I would say more times than not, everyone has it at ready in their pocket. A cell phone may be used for this purpose only if the reception in the area is reliable. If a cell phone will not furnish reliable communication in the work area, the employer will ensure a means of summoning emergency services. A lot of the times, the guys are working either out in the field or vice versa if they're working indoors, as we're talking about today. Supervisors, management may not be immediately in the area. If they need to go and get in touch with supervision, with management, they need to go and get in touch with them now, especially if we're talking about heat illness. Heat illness. First aid measures and emergency medical services will be provided if a supervisor observes or any employee reports any signs or symptoms of heat illness in an employee. The supervisor shall take immediate action with the severity of the illness. If the signs or symptoms are indicators of severe heat illness, the employer must implement emergency response procedures. An employee exhibiting signs or symptoms of heat illness shall be monitored and shall not be left alone or sent home without being offered on-site first aid and or being provided with EMS services. As I was saying, for heat exhaustion, heat stroke, for those two, they are getting pretty severe at that point. You are going and absolutely dehydrated, you're losing your basic mindset. The people are going and potentially not able to go and convey a clear thought. Though to themselves, they may feel I am good enough to kind of go and patch myself up and get myself home for the rest of the day. They may not be. Should go and at least monitor that. If we're not professionally trained on how to go and do first aid, go and be able to go and diagnose what heat exhaustion or heat stroke looks like. Sometimes it's better just to go and call EMS to go and get them and get the professionals in there to go and ensure that everything is correct after all. The employer must have effective procedures for contacting emergency medical services and, if necessary, transport employees to a place where they can be reached by an emergency medical provider. That does not mean go and throw that employee who is dealing with severe heat illness in the back of the pickup truck and driving them to a hospital or any other place of service yourself. That is not your job. That is not going to go and be the right means of doing it. If they need to get transported out of the building, that means go and calling EMS. Ensuring that in the event of an emergency, clear and precise directions to the work site can and will be provided as necessary to the emergency responder. Going and dealing with somebody that's dealing with heat stroke, heat exhaustion. I really hope nobody that's listening today has had to go and deal with something like that. It is a scary experience. It is something that really wish upon nobody. In that situation, mindsets, the people that are going and trying to help aren't going and thinking clearly, going and taking a moment to kind of step back, analyze, assess the situation. Try to calm yourself down. I'm not saying take 5-10 minutes. I'm saying 2 to 3 seconds is all it really normally takes. Going and thinking calmly, clearly, thoroughly to go and give the proper information. So, acclimatization, as I kind of stated early on, it is for that new person that is coming on during peak season when it's getting hot. Maybe they're not used to going and working at that tempo and working in those environments. They need to go and get used to it. It takes time. Per OSHA, they are given up to 14 days in which they can be observed and supervised by either management or by a designated personnel. With that, they need to go and at least be checked in on. It isn't exclusive to that new employee. It can go and be to anybody that's going to a different work environment, going from said office to going and working next to that machine that is hot. They need to go and make sure that they are acclimated properly to that new tempo of work and to that new work environment. Where no effective engineering controls are in use to control the effect of outdoor heat on the indoor temperature, all employees shall be closely observed by a supervisor or designee during a heat wave. Now, if I remember correctly, that does not mean if you have 50 people working for you, one supervisor can watch all 50. I believe the cap of that number is at 20 personnel. One management personnel or designee person can go and look after upwards of 20 people. If that designee, that supervisor, doesn't have eyesight on the people immediate at hand, you can go and have wireless means of communication, whether it be walkie-talkie or even your cell phone. But as I said with a cell phone, it needs to have proper signal for it to work. Employee who has been newly assigned to any of the following shall be closely observed by a supervisor or designee for the first 14 days of the employee's employment. To a work area where the temperature or heat index, whichever is greater, equals or exceeds 87 degrees Fahrenheit, or to work involving the use of clothing that restricts heat removal where the temperature equals or exceeds 82 degrees Fahrenheit. to a high radiant heat work area where the temperature equals or exceeds 82 degrees Fahrenheit. Again, as I said, it's not just that new hire, it is anyone that is going from one work environment to another. It needs to go and get monitored and observed. Your basic training requirements. Effective training shall be provided to each supervisory and non-supervisory employee before the employee begins work that should reasonably be anticipated to result in exposure to the risk of indoor heat illness. In my opinion, the training requirements should not just be before the employee begins work. It should also be even if it's that 15-year veteran that's been doing the job for, like I said, 15 years. We go and kind of forget. If it isn't brought back to us and reminded, kind of go and put it wayside and eventually forget about it. Going and annual, biannual, just touch and go reminders, highly recommended to go and keep these guys ever vigilant on keeping themselves, not just themselves, but those around them. If you went and kept them vigilant and promoted self-monitoring amongst each other, going and keeping those guys honest amongst each other on proper water intake, going and making sure they're tracking each other, greatly beneficial. So required training topics. Effective employee training that speaks to your unique environment should be provided in the following topics. The environmental and personal risk factors for heat illness, as well as the added burden of heat load on the body caused by exertion, clothing, and personal protective equipment. As we said, a lot of those PPEs, most common that I've seen, coveralls, are going to go and trap heat in. Going and having a few adult beverages on Saturday, Sunday, coming to work on Monday, you're already kind of setting yourself behind the 8 ball by being dehydrated. Not only that, but probably that Monday morning, probably had a cup of coffee. Yet again, even further behind that 8 ball. Going and explaining that to everyone involved, whether directly or indirectly, could go and have it on everyone's kind of the back of mind, that mindset of going, how can I go and help myself and help fellow person around me? The employer's procedures for complying with the requirements of this standard, including the employer's responsibility to provide water, cool down rests, and access to first aid, as well as the employee's right to exercise their rights under these standards without retaliation. The importance of frequent consumption of small quantities of water, up to 4 cups per hour. When the work environment is hot and employees are likely to be sweating more than usual in the performance of their duties. Now, I don't just mean 8 cups. That is 8 fluid ounces. I mean, that is 8 fluid ounces of water. Simply put, 1 quart of water an hour is what is recommended. The concept, importance, and methods of acclimatization and of close observation during acclimatization. The different types of heat illness, the common signs and symptoms of heat illness, and appropriate first aid and or emergency responses to the different types of heat illness, and in addition, that heat illness may progress quickly from mild symptoms and signs to serious and life-threatening illness. A basic sign and symptom of heat illness can be as simple as what feels like a stress headache, what feels like a sinus headache, kind of in the front of your head, maybe even in the back of your head. Doesn't matter. If you're starting to, while in the middle of your day, randomly start getting a headache, probably a basic sign of dehydration. Your body is talking to you. Let it go and actually say what it needs to say, and actually go and respond in kind and doing the proper what you need to be done. That doesn't mean go and get a Diet Coke to go and hydrate yourself. The importance to employees of immediately reporting to the employer directly or through the employee's supervision, symptoms or signs of heat illness in themselves or in coworkers. The employer's procedures for responding to signs or symptoms of possible heat illness, including how emergency medical services will be provided should they become necessary. With bullet 6, it should be promoted, it should be emphasized, it should be recommended from management down to go and report in any signs or issues with heat illness. It is a serious issue. A lot of the times employees don't want to go and speak up about it. Go and promote it. Make sure that they understand that you are there to go and help them throughout their 40 hours a week. The employer's procedures for contacting emergency medical services and for transporting employees to a point where they can be reached by an emergency medical service provider. The employer's procedures for ensuring that in the event of an emergency, clear and precise directions to the work site will be provided to emergency responders. These procedures shall include designating a person to be available to ensure that emergency procedures are invoked when appropriate. Simply put, with this, making sure that there's clear communication on the do's and don'ts, maybe even doing a dry run, doing some sort of in-house training, or going and contacting for further training, ongoing and emergency procedures, maybe even going and learning basic CPR first aid skills for those that are immediate on the job site. Prior to supervising employees, effective training on the following topics shall be provided. Shall be provided, not should be provided. All topics covered prior. Procedures to follow to implement the applicable provisions in the standard. Procedures to follow when the employee exhibits signs or reports symptoms of heat illness, including emergency response procedures. Those emergency response procedures can be as simple as calling 911. Where the work area is affected by outdoor temperatures, how to monitor weather reports, and how to respond to hot weather advisories. A lot of the times when we're working warehouses, if we're working enclosed buildings with metal roofs, though it may be 85 degrees outside, during the day that is getting baked. It's essentially an oven. We all know this. It goes and can potentially feel a whole lot warmer in that inside that building as opposed to outside. All right. Indoor heat illness prevention plan. Everything needs to be written. Everything needs to be planned in advance. The employer shall establish, implement, and maintain an effective heat illness prevention plan. The plan shall be in writing in both English and the language understood by the majority of the employees, and shall be made available at the worksite to employees and to Cal OSHA representatives. It should be recommended for the employees to actually go and read it. It affects them directly. If it affects them directly, they should go and be knowledgeable on how not only the do's and don'ts of dealing with heat illness, but then also the indoor heat illness prevention plan. This plan can be added to your IIPP or heat illness prevention program and shall contain at minimum procedures for drinking water requirements, procedures for access to cooldown areas, procedures to measure and record temperature or heat index, whichever is greater from those two. Identify and evaluate all other environmental risk factors for heat illness and implement control measures. Emergency response procedures and procedures for close observation during acclimatization. I know for 1 and 2, it almost seems silly to go and explain to grown adults how to go and, as I jokingly say, how to drink water. But again, a lot of the times that gets overlooked. The job at hand gets overlooked for your individual safety. Go and make sure they understand the procedures, make sure they understand what their rights are, what they're available to go and do. Make sure they understand how much water they should be drinking, rather than just saying 1 quart per hour. Give them some sort of visual aid so they get a clear understanding of what that actually looks like. Procedures for access to cooldown areas. Again, it sounds silly saying this is the break room. You have access to this. This is the cooldown area. You have access to this. But nonetheless, make sure all those topics are covered. All right, so in summary, today, as I said, it is a proposed standard. As of right now, it is still being finalized. It is still being refined. There can be revisions still done between now and the final standard. Keep in touch with it. Keep eyes on it. We went over definitions, water requirements, access to cooldown areas, assessment and control measures, emergency response procedures, acclimatization, training requirements, and then indoor heat illness prevention plan. So if you need any further resources, you can go with a QR scanner down on the bottom. Go ahead, open your phones, open the camera on your phone. If you have an iPhone, you have the latest update. If you just open your camera and put the QR code in the middle of your camera, it will automatically go and open up the information provided. If you have an Android, go ahead, download that QR app. Same procedure, open your camera. With that app, it will go and pop up all the information to your phone. I would advise save it to your phone. Though we want to go and save that data space for Angry Birds or whatever game it is that we have, might go and be best practice for you guys to go and have this.